Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of The Fourth Leg. This is your host, Philip Reiner. This series is focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command, control, and communications, and its increasingly complicated future. With this series, together with our partner Peter Hayes at the Nautilus Institute, we're going straight to the experts across multiple sectors to discuss the technical and policy challenges associated with NC3. Specifically, here in Season 2, we will discuss the necessity for a secure global crisis communications capability. There's a great deal to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to our podcast, The Fourth Leg. This is your host, Philip Reiner. We're very excited to kick off a second season of these in-depth discussions of issues associated with modernizing nuclear command and control and communication systems. And we get to do so today with quite an illustrious group. The international nature of this discussion today is very reflective of our overall NC3 project and the work that has gone into it, but even more so of this specific project that we're going to talk about here today. First and foremost, thank you to Admiral John Gower in the UK, Eric Grosse here in California, Subrata Banik in Bangalore, and our longstanding partner in this effort, Peter Hayes, who's out in Australia. Thank you for being with us here today. I wanted to just take a quick moment up front and say very, very briefly by way of background for our listeners. We started this project, this NC3 overarching project, with the January 2019 workshop at Stanford University, hosted by Secretary George Shultz. It was keynoted by General John Hyten. And hopefully you've all had a chance to listen to the podcasts and the slew of papers that came out of that workshop that we released over the course of 2019. Those discussions really highlighted some problems that we wanted to dig further into. We did so in a workshop last fall at Stanford, kindly hosted by Colin Call at CSAC. And that's where we delved into really what is one of the more complicated technical elements of all of these NC3 related issues. We did it with an outstanding team, a number of whom are represented here today. And we're here today to talk about the forthcoming report based off of that workshop and to talk about the problem and its potential solution. Peter, as you've played such a critical role in this conversation from the very outset, I'd like to ask you to kind of say a couple words on the context of this.
Thanks very much, Philip. I guess the key issue that came up in our prior discussions was the notion that relative to the Cold War, when things were complicated but also relatively clear, today we live in a world of interdependence where things are rapidly becoming very complex, less stable, more chaotic. And this is a situation that is compounded by a variety of disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence that are being introduced into nuclear command and control communication systems, combined with or compounded by the effects of kind of supersaturated social media and public communication system between political leaders. And I think what we discovered in the first two workshops and in all the work, the background work, is that the history of the near misses of nuclear war in the Cold War and post-Cold War period show that trust, or the absence of trust, and the willingness to communicate when there was very little trust in the midst of a crisis were really critical attributes of successful resolution of those crises without escalation to the first use of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And clearly today, trust is somewhat in short supply. So it's really critically important and very urgent that we have a system available to nuclear commanders at the highest level where they have assured ability to communicate with not only their own forces, but just as important in some respects, those of their adversary. And this can't be done through social media. The existing official hotlines in some respects are antiquated and bureaucratic. But our sense is that it might be achieved from a private, secure communication systems using new technology and developed in a collaborative manner. And that was a proposal put forward by Eric. And that was really the focus of the discussion at our last workshop and of the report we're about to publish called Last Chance. And it's about nuclear crisis communications.
So as Peter alludes to there, Eric, really your thinking on this and inspiration in large part has driven us through the workshop in the fall of last year. If you don't mind, for those perhaps who haven't had a chance to read the paper that you did for the first workshop, the podcast we did with you about those topics, if you could give us just a quick sense of kind of the insight, the thought that you had about this potential comms capability, this backup, maybe additive thin line, if you will.
As Peter says, I can't imagine a more important project than to make sure that we don't accidentally go to war because of a miscommunication. That would be tragic. So we're keen here to have a communication system that the command leaderships of different nations can use in a crisis. And that's challenging for all the reasons of an NC3 system. But then on top of that is challenging because we need a system that is interoperable and resilient. And each of the countries can independently check for themselves. Even though they don't trust each other, they need to be able to talk to each other. And so that's a challenging design problem. We want something that's secure against the world's best hackers and yet open enough that everybody can check it for themselves. That's not been done very often before. So that's exciting as a technical problem. It needs to work in an environment in which the network may be intermittent. We may not have very high bandwidth in a crisis time. So that's also a challenge. Fortunately, in this hotline context, we can probably get away with a little bit less than one would want in a full-blown NC3 system. It's probably enough to have the ability to send text messages and perhaps a photograph, because you want to be carefully composing messages between countries anyway. I'm sure there'll be folks trying to think this through and worry about how the translation works and so forth. So I think this is a system that has some unique challenges, but if we can build it, it could be very valuable.
And I appreciate that. I think one of the most critical elements of this, in addition to the technical considerations, is how does this fit into political considerations? And John, from your perspective, having worked with these systems over the years, is there a political appetite for a system that we're talking about?
I think it's true that there's never been a greater need for a system like this in this increasingly multipolar and fractured nuclear weapons world. Whether that is appreciated is a point which I might come back to later in the discussion. But certainly, as Peter said and Eric outlined, the old hotlines where they did exist were generally one-to-one. Just the US and the Soviet Union, or latterly perhaps Pakistan and India, while they still have value, no nuclear crisis going forward will ever be in isolation between two nuclear-armed states. Whatever happens between those two will have an immediate impact on the reaction and effect of the other nuclear-armed states, whether they're in the same hemisphere or not. So the challenge is, I agree, a secure, trusted and tested multipolar system which allows all of the nuclear command authorities in any crisis, if they wish to do so, to communicate. And obviously much more on the political issues later in the conversation.
Yeah, and it'll be a theme that comes up throughout the conversation. I think, hey, Eric, if I could go back to something you were saying in terms of the security of the system, I mean, we're all becoming so accustomed to using things like Zoom to communicate with each other as we're all in lockdown. You've got things like Signal nowadays. Why doesn't that cover the need?
Well, that's a good point. Those tools are pretty good, and I always feel whatever you're used to using in normal times, if it's working the crisis, keep using that because you understand the ins out. That's a good thing. So by all means, keep those tools in mind for crisis communications. But what if someday it's a computer virus instead of the coronavirus? Those existing systems are well regarded, but they're depending on devices and networks that might go down in a crisis. It's just very hard to make those systems strong against the kinds of cyber attacks that we know nations are capable of. So we think it's valuable to have a system that is hardened the way one would harden an NC3 system, but designed for this interoperable nature. And so we're talking about building a full system, the hardware and the software, full out, tried out with real people, and subject that to international red team testing. So we find out in advance what some of the glitches are.
I'd like to, particularly for our listeners, those of us who were in the workshop in October and who have had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time around yourself and Ron Minnick and others who have given us a detailed laydown of the risks posed by some modern day digital technologies and the vulnerabilities that are inherent to them in the software, the firmware, the hardware. Eric and Subrata, I think it would be really useful for the listeners if you could talk a little bit more about that, quote unquote, cyber element of this problem and how in the midst of a pandemic, there's pressing issues that need addressing, but that remains a responsibility as something that we need to make sure that we're getting ahead of before this itself becomes a problem in crisis communications. Could you speak a little bit more? Perhaps maybe we start with Eric and then go to Subrata to talk a little bit more about the cyber challenge itself.
The typical platforms that we use today are very general purpose and great for doing a lot of different things in your life. But because they have so many different features, they have a lot of what we call attack surface. And it's just seems to be beyond the state of the art to find a way to build those systems so that they don't get hacked. You can do a reasonable job. You can try to hide behind a firewall, but you find out the bad guys somehow find a weak system behind your firewall and laterally move from that to the supposedly stronger system you had that somehow shared, maybe not to your knowledge, somehow shared some components with the weaker system. So it is a challenge. We know that from the way enterprises do get hacked today. Even well-run enterprises have a hard time with this. We think the best way to solve this problem, and after all, you're never going to know until the crisis hits. We think the best way to get some assurance here is to build something that has much less complexity, many fewer features, and that we can subject to strenuous testing and get a sense for how well it can stand up to today's cyber adversaries. So that's on the system front. That means still has to interoperate. So still going to talk over networks, but we want the system itself to have a much stronger resistance to anything but the few communication features essential to a hotline. Now, the network itself is a challenging problem as well, and maybe Subrata can talk about the network aspect of it.
Thanks, Eric. I was kind of thinking that maybe I will start with the communication part where you just left. I think the communication is key here. And when it comes to the communication between two decision makers from the different cultural background, political background, it definitely raises a big concern as trust. So in order to address that, I think what we try to build, and as Eric says, that we try to build a simple, most realistic, trusted computing device, which will be there operable in a crisis management condition. So when we say this trusted, there's a keyword, right? So the keyword might create a confusion or it's a conflicting point because people will start asking questions. Okay, if it is trusted, then where this device is getting built? How could you trust nation that is building this device, etc., etc., right? I think the key problem that this caroling is supposed to address is that it is committed to develop using an open source technology where every component that's going to build around this system, whether it's a hardware, it's a processor, it's a firmware, kernel, software, application, network, everything is open and transparent. And when we talk about this open source things, and I think we already covered that as a part of our workshop last year, that is a key here. So that combining trust into open source it's helped to provide this simple, trusted communication device that will be the end goal of this problem.
Yeah, thank you, Subrata. That's a great segue into a little bit of a more in-depth conversation around what it is that we're talking about. So, we've identified the problem a little bit. I think we'll talk about that in more detail. But for those who are going to be reading the synthesis paper, and I'd ask Eric, what is it that we're actually talking about? So Eric alluded to the two different pieces of this. There's an actual device, but that there's also a network that we were talking about as part of what we're calling Catalink.
Sure. So the overall architecture that we're envisioning here is a small device we call the puck that is the most hardened element of the system in the sense that it's the only one that holds the secrets. It's the only device on which one can actually read the content of the messages being exchanged. And this little device, one imagines, could be carried by a military aide to the president or a device of that sort, a small thing that can be kept under good physical control and rugged enough to carry with you wherever you're going, quickly plug in and boot up rapidly and be a communication endpoint node. That's the puck. And we can go into a little more detail about what are the elements of it, but that envision a small device, maybe a little bit larger than a smartphone, but something with much less complexity than a smartphone. It's really a small computer. A Raspberry Pi is a familiar computer to many people that think of something at sort of that level. And so that's the only piece we have to test in cryptographic terms. But because that's often offline in somebody's briefcase, it's not constantly connected to the world. So we envision that device, that puck, talks to another device that is more or less constantly plugged in, connected to strong power, stays up, has many kinds of network connectivity. And it's that other device that is the one where you can afford to have a little more complex software, maybe some AI that checks the status of all the network connections. And that node doesn't have to be quite as super secure as the puck. So that's a sort of overall architecture of how we're splitting up the workload here.
Yeah, so the puck is designed to send very short, succinct messages between the leadership of nuclear weapon states. And of course, that would be encrypted. We'll come back to the encryption solution that Eric and others have in mind. But it, of course, needs to have a supporting system that will get across all sorts of different communication networks the message from one leader to another, or one leader to five other nuclear leaders, depending on the kind of conflict that we're looking at. Because as John pointed out, there's really no such thing anymore as a two-way only nuclear threat system or nuclear conflict. If there's a nuclear threat in international affairs, it affects pretty much all the nuclear weapon states simultaneously. And so we need a system that can communicate very quickly with short, clear messages. And in what we'll call peacetime, which is when nuclear threat is being used for strategic deterrence, but no one has an immediate intention to use nuclear weapons against another state, the supporting communication system, which we call ROCs, for Resilient Omni-Frequency Crisis Communication System. Now, there's a mouthful. I won't try and say that again. But the ROCs would really be a low data rate network, and it could work over all sorts of commercial networks, fiber optic cables, different frequencies over radio. And in this pre-wartime, in this routine strategic deterrence condition, really all it has to do is keep on talking to all the different endpoints to make sure we know on a daily basis it's being tested and that it works and it's available to those who have pucks. What we really need it to be there for, of course, is when we're in a bit of a crisis, when one or more or two or more nuclear weapon states are on alert and they're poised to use nuclear weapons, or they're perhaps involved in some conventional war that could escalate to nuclear war. That kind of condition, the real purpose of Catalink and the supporting communications system would be to help them back away from the brink of nuclear war. And if they were to fall off that brink, then the ROCS system working with the pucks would enable communications between the nuclear commanders to actually end a nuclear war as early as possible. And in context, of course, many of the commercial systems, radio systems, will be already highly degraded by the effects of nuclear war, and we'll have to use ad hoc and improvise what are called meshed networks, which are kind of bottom-up relay systems, which are, would use emergency relays, balloons, drones, rockets, emergency tiny satellites that might be launched, and also some of the existing commercial mesh network systems. There's one, for example, called GoTenma mesh, which is out there, and that enables you to link cell phones over about a 5-mile radius with no actual operating cell phone towers. It's a direct communication mesh network, which has worked in a number of disaster response scenarios. So the key thing here is to make sure that the ROCS is always on, that it's tested, that it's continuously rehearsed, people are familiar with it, so when they turn to it when they're under real stress and they think this is their last chance, they're confident will actually convey their message to their adversary who's staring down the nuclear barrel at the same time.
And just to pull that thread a little bit further, that confidence, right, is very much going to be reliant on the integrity of the system, both the puck, as Eric described, and this ROCS network that you just described, Peter. Well, what's even more important is something that Subrata had begun to allude to, is this trust. And one of the most challenging elements of what we're proposing here, and the question we get very often from people as we speak to them about it, is this question of buy-in. And so, as someone who's deeply experienced in working with these types of capabilities and working both on the military side of this, but also the political side of this, having worked in MOD, would really benefit from hearing your perspective on what it'll take to bring people on board to trust something like this and come together and actually be willing to adopt a system of this sort.
Well, I wouldn't want to underestimate the challenge in that. I think there are essentially 5 political phases that would need to be gone through to turn this from a concept with a reasonable chance of a technical solution to something that actually has application. I think the first phase is an agreement of need and a public agreement of need. And that is really challenging, and I'll return to that. But assuming you get through that gate, then I think there is, to build the trust, you need to agree an agent state, a non-nuclear armed state, to act as the coordinator, the honest broker, and to work on agreeing terminology. And I don't just mean technical terminology. One of the challenges in nuclear deterrence is that you can articulate the clearest message that you think you can, but it's got to cross a language and a cultural barrier in up to 8 other different directions. I think one of the challenges within this is the understanding of what is meant by what is being said and what is being typed is understood across the board of all the nations who will be on that. That is not an insignificant task. But assuming you step through that hurdle or over that hurdle, then you're into a trial of it, a feasibility trial. And again, it's challenging as to how you do that, because you fundamentally have 2 choices. Either you go the easy route, which is to pick a group of allies and friends, say France, the US, and the UK within the NATO construct to trial it. But that risks potential adversaries becoming instantly suspicious of the process. Or you give it to a different path. So, for instance, India, Pakistan, you have some experience, and more recently, in the use of hotlines and communications on the brink. Or you do it, you grab the bull by the horns and go for the big players, and you say US, Russia, and China, you test it. But I think that's a job for the negotiating skills of the agent state. Once you've done that and you've assessed the positive and negative effects of testing within allies or between adversaries, you need to roll out and test, and then subsequently discuss and agree future use. But I think the most important thing to remember throughout this, and one of the challenges that the world will have outside of the nuclear states, is the production and use of this is only as a preventer of nuclear weapon use. It's not a legitimizer or an extender of possession. And the final point I'll make, which I think is an important political point early in this, because whilst I agree there's a risk of AI and ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, I do slightly disagree with Peter's opening statement. It's not yet in nuclear command and control networks. But we must not forget that one advantage of this system is that by making human decision makers central to the system, you give some degree of insulation against future admittance of AI and ML into state and military decision making and analysis, because you make this a point at which human beings will talk to other human beings. So there is an additional advantage of this that perhaps hasn't come out in conversation before.
That's actually a really great point. And yeah, there's been so much discussion as of late, including from our own organization, Technological Obscurity, where we've talked about how machine learning may be integrated into these command and control systems and the relative merits of that, the risks, vulnerabilities that creates. But yes, that's a great point, John. Keeping a human in the loop as part of that decision-making process, this could lend technical credence to any sort of doctrinal position that states that that's where countries are going to stand. I wanted to ask very specifically, John, you alluded to this kind of plus minus scenario where you initiate just between allies or you try to initiate between adversaries. Peter, with your international perspective on this, what countries do you think would be most interested in something like this? Where does the greatest need really lie?
Well, I guess my view is that the really big nuclear weapon states like the United States, Russia, and China, have very well developed, mature systems, and of course France and the UK at a much smaller scale also have very mature and well established systems. And in some respects, the real risk of nuclear war doesn't involve those powers directly. It lies more at the regional level in places like the Korean Peninsula or South Asia between India and Pakistan, or in the Middle East involving Israeli nuclear weapons. And it's precisely in those states where one worries, I think, with some reason, that the nuclear command and control communication systems may not be as well developed as in the great power and the big nuclear weapon states. So whilst I wouldn't discount the interest in the long-established nuclear weapon states in such a system once it's available, particularly if it's brought into play by major private actors, not just states, it seems to me that the interest in India and Pakistan could be really important. I think that the North Koreans, provided it's an open source technology, the code is available to them, that's their primary concern, and they are avid adopters of these kinds of softwares and hardwares. They generally want to build them themselves, but that's something that I've seen very directly over many years, and most recently in a meeting with the North Koreans on power systems last December in Mongolia. They weren't interested in training or technology transfer. They just wanted the code. And we, of course, said, well, you can't have that because it's not open source. It's proprietary. But in this context, if it's open source, I think they would look at it very seriously. And I think Germany might be interested in playing a role here as a leading promoter of open source software at a global level. And then finally, I think some of the nuclear weapons prohibitionist states might also find a common cause with the nuclear weapons states in such a system, because they could see that it could facilitate both risk reduction measures in the short term, for example, some of those that are related to the potential proliferation of bioweapons threats in a pandemic era. And they may also find that this is a way that they can facilitate the long-run reduction in nuclear weapons in the 9 nuclear weapon states, which does imply strengthening nuclear command and control communication systems as numbers go down in order to preserve the credibility of those forces. Now, I understand John's point that the flip side of that is you don't want to legitimate those very nuclear weapons, but it is in everyone's interests to facilitate that downward trajectory, and a system like Catalink could play an important supplementary supporting role in that direction.
For sure. And John, to turn to you a little bit in terms of, you alluded to this in just a moment ago, possibly non-nuclear weapon states as serving as sponsors for a system of this sort. Your thoughts on which states that might actually be best served by?
No, I absolutely agree with Peter on the need for something like this becoming as important, if not more important, if you achieve finally a negative trajectory in arms numbers. But I raised it as the issue about legitimacy. I raised it as it's going to be one of the challenging political issues. The problems are not just going to be getting over the political hurdles raised by the nuclear armed states. Anything that adds value to the nuclear armed states is seen as negative in some areas. So I think, where does the greatest need lie? Where is this most likely to be taken up? Well, I think if you look at greatest lead, that's where the greatest risk is. And that's with the nuclear armed states with systems which most risk misinterpretation or miscalculation. So dual-use systems that are delegated, systems that are designed to fight war rather than strictly strategic deterrence. And then nuclear armed states with the most volatile relationships right now. Start with them, certainly. And then, rather enigmatically, perhaps with the nuclear armed states who feel they need it the least. They're probably the ones who need it the most. And I think that's possibly the hardest sell out there. I think it is important, though, that this is not seen as a badge of achievement and is only held by the nuclear armed states. There is a dilemma which I shall come to perhaps later in our discussions about the benefits and risks of making this more than just a nuclear exchange preventer of last resort. But I think it's most important that this is not just simply something that the nuclear armed states dial into, particularly if they then go and use it for something else as well, because that becomes a club into which other people might wish to join. And if the only price of membership is a nuclear weapon, that's not a positive thing.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that as we have delved into this, the conversations that we have had with states in South Asia at a very senior level who have intimated an interest in helping pursue this, at least at a conceptual level. As Peter mentioned, some folks in Europe, to include the Germans, and here in the United States, some conversations with folks who are in senior positions who would, have an impact on a decision around whether or not to help push something like this forward, have, again, intimated an interest in this conceptually. What I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit back to where we had started to go in terms of the technical conversation. So we've gone a little bit out to, how do you create norms around this and communities of interest? But I'd like to come back to the technical element of this and ask Subrata. You had started to talk about some of the technical challenges and some of the potential solutions through using open source. That's come up a couple of times now since you mentioned it. What, from your perspective, are some of the most challenging technical aspects of creating a system like this? What is actually needed to make a hotline of this sort to be secure and reliable?
Yeah, Philip. Yeah, I think already Peter touched upon on the open source part. That is a good starter. And for the technical challenges, I would like to take the liberty to divide these technical challenges into two aspects. Let's start with the design aspect. So we are sitting in an era where all the competitions around us are spending to build a most complex system. So there we are talking to build a radical simple system which solves the purpose of communication in the crisis situation, right? So building a simple system sometimes looks funny, but yeah, it's indeed a challenge. And when we additionally talked about the global acceptance of the device not only has to be used by one or two country. Peter touch upon, John touch upon the multiple nuclear weapon country and non-nuclear country, and might be a different use case of this device. That is a big challenge in my opinion. And coming to the development aspect, right? So we covered the design part, so maybe you can take a summary of design part, maybe two part: simplicity of the device and adaptation. Coming to the development part, so we are talking about a dedicated team with a various domain expertise like hardware, firmware, software, crypto, validation. They are all working from the different part of the globe on a single product deadline or milestone basis regularly, right? It's indeed a challenge managing this many people and meeting our end goal of this device, right? And distribution. It's a challenge to me. I'd like to go a little deep to answer your question that you asked about what makes this Catalin kind of hotline right secure and reliable, right? So, like in my opinion, right, there is a trust, right? So hotline would be secure, reliable. It depends on the trust. So the trust that we are built inside the hardware while we are building the device, how much trust we put in inside our hardware in terms of trusted processor, trusted hardware, and then we have this root of trust integrated inside the firmware and wrapped with the verified boot flow to ensure that it's a secure system that is coming up. And additionally, we are talking about a network where we have this additional user level verification method to ensure authorized access at each communication endpoint, means in the both at the sender and receiver side, right? So trust built inside the hardware and trust built during the communication makes a hotline secure in my opinion.
And it is definitely something that has come out throughout these discussions over and over again as the way to get at this. In concept was around this notion of that radical simplicity through which you can try to build some of that trust. Eric, if we could ask for you to talk a little bit about how you would approach that. What exactly does that look like from a technical perspective?
Well, computer scientist Tony Hoare really put it best in his Turing Award lecture. He said, there are two ways of constructing a software design. One way is to make it so simple that there are obviously no deficiencies. And the other way is to make it so complicated that there are no obvious deficiencies. The first method is far more difficult. It demands skill, devotion, insight, and a willingness to accept a compromise when conflicting objectives cannot be met. That's our motto here. We're really going for that kind of a spirit. It's almost like going back to software on the scale of systems back in the 70s and 80s, where, remember, we actually did have general purpose computers back then. They were quite capable, and they were orders of magnitude less software. So we want to go back to that. So in a way, you get complexity when you're trying to optimize a system a lot. And we see that because hardware has gotten so much faster, if we are willing to lower our sights a little bit on not building a high frame rate video game, but if we're willing to be exchanging text messages and some still photos, and we're using high speed modern hardware, we should be able to simplify the system design a lot and still have perfectly satisfactory performance. And so that's one of the ways that we believe it's possible to build much simpler systems. We're trying to get back to the good old days in some ways. I should probably also say it's all well and good to talk about security and trust and simplicity and all this, but in some ways you don't know whether you've built a secure system if you don't have a clear statement of what you are trying to achieve in the first place. So let me pull just the first statement at the beginning of this hotline cryptography paper out, so we have a clear statement of what it is we're trying to achieve. So imagine you have a group of countries, A, B, C, some more, They want to exchange messages with the assurance that when A sends a message, B promptly receives it, unmodified, and knows it came from A. The sender A can also pick any subset of that group, doesn't always have to send it to the whole group, and that intended recipient list is part of the message. So this group knows who they're talking among. Anyone outside that group has no technical means to forge messages or to see the content of the messages. Maybe they can see the length of the message. They know there's some communication going on, but they can't look inside or modify it. So we have a crisp statement of what it is we're trying to do in security terms. The hardest cryptographic problem is usually key management. Here's another place where we're taking the simplicity to try to build something that is more trustworthy, not just in the sense that the mathematics is right, but in the sense that the ordinary people running the system understand what security guarantees they're getting. So for key management, we envision face-to-face pairwise meetings. You see, these national leaders are already coming together on the order of once a year, once every few years at the United Nations or the G7 or wherever. So when these two leaders meet, in addition to the substantive conversation they have, they or their attachés can physically exchange keys. Take these two pucks from opposing sides, plug them together, and they can create new key pairs and use those when they're again separated. So that enables them to understand in simple terms exactly what security properties they're going to get. They know whether the message is forged or not because they know for sure who had the keys. That's the kind of thing I mean by simplicity.
So one of the questions that I know is going to arise for folks who are listening to this discussion, they're going to question, how do you actually go through an open source process and develop the puck that you're describing, Eric, and where do you source something like that? Where do you find a fab where you can actually build something from the bottom up? How do you do this out of respect for cost and through an international approach, building in that cryptographical piece that you're referring to? I mean, is that really feasible? Subrata, from where you sit in Bangalore, is this something that can actually be accomplished?
Looking at the timeline and the urgency that we have right now, right, to develop the proto and at least start getting the feedback from this different geopolitical people, right? So I would like to go with a country which has this ecosystem already built in, maybe Taiwan or PRC, might be. Yeah, Eric can provide more details here. But if you are little bit relaxed and kind of do a exploration kind of activity, then maybe we can think about country like India as well for developing this. And as you already touch upon that, whether it's realistic to build something in Bangalore, I would say, yeah, this is a possibly opportunity for country like India, where manufacturing such secure device, trusted device with this crypto in place and all, right, this will be aligned with the government long-term plan. I think you might have heard about Make in India campaign. So yeah, I believe it's fairly possible, but there is a catch here, right? So the catch is that when we talk about the multinational level discussion, right, there is a very standard way that we have a product development life cycle, right? So you need to understand what we are basically trying to develop. So everybody need to align on a specification. So that we call as a product specification. So as long as every stakeholder is aligned on the specification and we sorted out uh, any conflict before that to minimize the cost, right? We definitely don't like to reach a state where we start developing something on rush and then based on the conflict, we thought of maybe, okay, design it another way, because we need to understand that it involves a cost to do a schematic design, review, create a new hardware, right? It involved a lots of cost angle into that. So yeah, I'd say that we should start doing a product specification development, then get a feedback, maybe from the political, from technical side, from the different country representative. Then we start going into the development model.
And Eric, do you have thoughts on how Subrata just laid that down?
Sure. I think what he's described is exactly right. And I know that one of the concerns I hear when we talk about this with people from the traditional defense space is, if I can sort of paraphrase, exaggerate in a sense. They say, Eric, are you telling me you think the U.S. military is going to use a system where all the source code is out in the open? Some of it's checked in by people from, let's say, Russia. You expect them to run that software on a piece of hardware assembled in China? Are you crazy? And I say, well, yes, I probably am crazy. And yes, that is what we expect. But remember, this isn't a system we're building for the U.S. military to talk to itself. This is a system we're talking, the U.S. military would talk to the Chinese military. So, okay, maybe it's built in China, but we're just using it to talk to China. They're going to read these messages anyway, obviously. So I think it is reasonable to envision that people who traditionally are only going to use something that they designed and built themselves, they're willing to, in this context, use an international effort. And with the hardware in particular, in addition to knowing whether it actually works the way it's supposed to, you're always worried about whether it has some other things. Does it secretly eavesdrop or have a microphone built inside or something? And so it's important that this design is sufficiently open that, let's say, the U.S. is skeptical of using hardware built in fabrication lines abroad. Well, fine. They can manufacture the system on their own trusted fab lines. Might cost a little more, but not severely so. So I think we have a reasonable strategy here.
So to kind of back up again, so now we've talked about the global context, we've talked about the problem, we've delved a little into the technical elements of how this might actually work. To put this into a more immediate context, I'd like to ask Peter to talk a little bit more about how this Catalink system, as we're calling it, how it's supposed to augment pre-existing systems, right? The argument can well be made that tons and tons of money have been invested in these capabilities. And what sort of gaps would a system like this actually address? And how do you envision that working? What are some examples of those gaps?
Well, as far as I know, none of the nuclear command and control communication systems of the nuclear armed states are designed to communicate with their adversaries, yet their very fate is dependent on what the adversaries do with their nuclear command and control communication system. In the 21st century, it seems to me, we have 9 nuclear weapon states. Between them, there are about 17 active nuclear threat relationships between those nuclear weapon states. That's not taking into account states that don't have nuclear weapons that might be threatened by those who do. And of those relationships, only 7 have hotlines in place. And of the nuclear weapon states, Israel and the DPRK have no hotlines with other nuclear weapon states at all. So it seems to me there's a lot of need here for an absolutely minimal standard, a global norm, if you like, that all these states must have a basic capacity to communicate with each other. As an example of this, if I may just go quickly to the Korean Peninsula, which involves the United States, North Korea, China, and Russia directly in a nuclear relationship. It's a 4-way relationship, and there are targeted states, that's South Korea and Japan, that are non-nuclear weapon states that are also subject to nuclear threat. So it's a quite complex set of threat relationships. Now, there is in fact a hotline. There are multiple hotlines, both political and military, between North and South Korea since about 1971 was the first one that was set up, pretty much a mill-to-mill channel. And then a political leaders, that's between Kim Jong-un and the current president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, hotline was set up in 2018. So there is, in fact, inter-Korean hotlines, which is occasionally put to good use, sometimes just ignored, especially on the North Korean side, in crisis. But there is no hotline between the two primary adversaries involving nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula at all, which is the United States and North Korea. Now, we know that Donald Trump said he gave Kim Jong-un his phone number for urgent calls. And we know that Donald Trump has used Twitter publicly to send messages to signal to North Korea about, meeting him at the DMZ last year, which apparently took Pyongyang 12 minutes to respond to. So, there are communication channels in and out of Pyongyang, but none of those channels are reliable in the way that we're talking about, nor secure, nor encrypted. And it really does seem critically important that kind of communication channel be established, just to manage the situation sensibly and make sure that people don't slip over the edge inadvertently, let alone exploit the current situation due to the pandemic for their own political or military advantage.
I think that actually raises a question that I wanted to turn to John on, which is, we often hear this question of how the current pandemic, COVID-19, has impacted our thinking on this. And John, I wanted to ask how this has impacted your thoughts on when it comes to NC3 more broadly. If you don't mind sharing your perspective on this relative to the Catalink concept.
Yes, well, I mean, I think there is a danger of overemphasizing the potential effect of a pandemic like this on current nuclear command and control. And of course, Catalink is not about nuclear command and control in its essence. It's about exercising caution and restraint on those at the head of the nuclear command and control systems in each of the nuclear armed states. So really, at first glance, there's no direct link with the other world stresses, of which COVID is the latest, perhaps, and the most pressing. But you could also add the effects on states of climate change, or the advancing role and intrusion of machine learning and AI in their business, particularly their intelligence gathering and global picture management. And all of these things, all of these pressures, what they have in common is serve to make states nervous. And that's whether they're a nuclear armed state or not. Nervous for security, nervous for their economy, and nervous even about their societal cohesion, and depending on the type of government, their ability to control their control of that society. And historically, all of these things have been triggers for external conflict. And it should also be said that nuclear armed states should never become nervous on their own, or nervous in a paranoid way about someone else. So a system like Catalink is a means of offering a path where such nervousness does not translate into miscalculation, misinterpretation, or escalation. But this is about prevention, as we've said. And particularly with nuclear weapons, it's not a case of prevention and cure. There is no cure. And while this is primarily a nuclear war or nuclear weapon employment prevention tool, once trusted and established, there's no reason why it couldn't have other uses. But I would strongly caveat that it couldn't just be the nuclear armed states that had it, as I've said earlier, else it becomes a sort of badge of precedence. But we have seen already, in my opinion, largely unfounded speculation due to the cause of this pandemic, the origin of the virus. There will be future pandemics. Something like Catalink would allow the kind of frank head of state to head of state discussions. And we have to remember, in the bioweapon and in the pandemic sphere, most nuclear armed states have exemption caveats. If they have a negative security assurance, they have an exemption caveat regarding bioweapons. So that kind of future worry or escalatory effect, in particular of a biological pandemic, does have a direct impact on nuclear weapon states' reactions. I'm not for the moment suggesting that that's an issue today, but one of the lessons from today for nuclear armed states is how certain will they be in the future.
One of the really fascinating pieces of this that I've discovered as we've done our research into the history of these systems was coming across in managing nuclear operations, that edited volume that Ash Carter and others put together back in the 80s, was this requirement that you just were speaking about, John, was actually noted in that text on a couple of different occasions as an outstanding requirement. And yet it almost seems like an afterthought. It's curious to me, why is that the case? And in terms of, this could be something that actually helps prevent a nuclear exchange or dial one down, God forbid, if it ever were to actually initiate. I'm curious if you could kind of put this into historical context for us.
Well, I think there's two themes to this. I'll come back to the examples where it might have been helpful. But I think the first theme is that modernization of nuclear systems, including NC3, is a national individual endeavor. And a hotline is inherently a collaborative endeavor between adversaries. And there's no prizes to guess which is the easiest one to do politically and to allocate time and money to. So I think that's the first factor. The second factor is, and Peter alluded to this, is the plethora and explosion of means of communication from the mid to late 80s to now, and it's been exponential, I think has possibly led to an assumption that there will be a means of having this communication, and the need to have a dedicated line where none existed. I mean, the trauma of making an international telephone call when I was a teenager has to be remembered to be understood. And simply doing that, you had to dedicate a particular line to be certain that Washington could simply speak to Moscow without going through 6 nosy operators on either side of the Atlantic. So I think, and this has led to what is one of the failings of the US DPRK exchange, was this diplomacy, and I use that term advisedly, conducted in full volume in public on Twitter. And I think one of the advantages of something like Catalink in reversing that negative trend is that modern communication, as we see on all platforms, allows instantaneous, unconsidered thought to turn into hard communication. And one of the things about a hotline is that it is the pinnacle of a decision and discussion system in a state where the head of state is taking advice. A communication takes place, it is considered, there is a considered response. It drives a return to that more focused diplomacy and thought process, which is what is necessary at the top of this. And I think the old hotlines don't work because of multipolar. The new communication systems don't bring the disciplines of hotlines. And so we're in a perfect storm where I suspect not even Ash Carter, who I know to be quite a visionary chap, would have seen the position we are in now, where heads of state are personally communicating to other heads of state independent of their organizations. And in normal diplomacy, that is challenging. In nuclear diplomacy, with all of the things we've talked about, it's suicide.
And I think one of the most important elements of what you're talking about, as these communications technologies have exponentially exploded, is the dramatic increase in the interconnectivity of these systems. And Peter, this is a theme that we've talked about since the outset of this NC3 project. Nothing really brings that home, I don't think, more than the current pandemic, if you will. But if Catalink then were available to international leaders, I mean, what's the point here? Is this really going to actually reduce the risk of nuclear war and address some of those gaps that John was just alluding to?
We can, speculate and also look back at history. And, as we speak, everything is changing as nothing is changing because of the pandemic. And I actually concur with what John said. It's easy to overstate the potential destabilizing impact of the pandemic on NC3 systems and or strategic deterrence or threat-based relationships, conflict relationships today. The fact is that, significant portions of the American command and control personnel are currently underground, sheltered in Cheyenne Mountain with no contact with the outside world because of COVID. And the missileers and American silos are now down there 14 days at a time instead of 24 hours at a time. So we really don't know whether nuclear weapons states are going to become more cautious at the moment because of COVID. But it's at moments of crisis that a system like Catalink is needed. We don't need it in routine peacetime. It's when things are going really badly and awry that we need the ability to communicate between adversaries who face shared existential threats, in this case, because they're pointing nuclear weapons at each other. But it's coming at the same time that they're facing these enormous climatic and pandemic and other challenges, which is undermining their resilience at a societal level. So even a tiny reduction in the risk of nuclear war by introducing a system like Catalink could have a really species-level, life-saving effect.
John, I wanted to come back to you, and I think you had one more follow-up there that we wanted to get to.
I think I just wanted to give a context in the time, because Peter very rightly raised some contextual contemporary issues relating to COVID. Catalink is not a tomorrow solution. It will bring a real-time, trustworthy and resilient one-to-one, one-to-many crisis calming system if we can get it adopted. But I think we just need to understand that I think planting the seed is possible and growing to a system is possible. The bit that is most challenging is germinating it in a parallel, adversarial and suspicious capitals. That's the central challenge. And I think as well as the technical challenges, there is one that requires careful thought and intelligent negotiation with, as I say, possibly a trusted, independent and neutral third state. And that probably is the next phase of the non-technical part of this project.
And this is a conversation that we look forward to continuing with yourself and this group and the others who have been involved. I think it's worth noting as we wrap up this initial conversation that we actually will have a follow-on series of about 9 additional papers and podcasts that will accompany this. We'll delve deeper into the problem. We'll delve deeper into the technical elements of a potential solution. And we will expand upon what John was just talking about to try to delve into where can we go from an international collaborative effort from here to make sure that this is something that everyone is bought into, that to make it a success. Really, to wrap up here, though, I just want to say thank you to Eric, to John, to Peter, all around the world, to Subrata. Thanks for joining us here today. This is a great conversation. We look forward to continuing with you. Thanks again to Eric, John, Subrata, and Peter. As always, thank you to our listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Fourth Leg. Be sure to check it out. While we embark on the effort to build a solution to this communication challenge, please get us your feedback and spread the word about what we're doing. As always, subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud and keep abreast of the latest at tech4gs.org. Until then, thanks to everybody for listening. We look forward to hearing from you.